You're listening to Motherhood in Between, the show for moms who want to rebuild their bodies, reclaim their energy, and keep pursuing the lives they're called to during the season between babies. I'm your host, Lauran Saunders, registered dietitian, mom of 2 and counting, and founder of Nourished Moms Collective. I help moms recover from their last pregnancy, prepare for their next one, and support their bodies and ambitions in the in-between season of motherhood. Because motherhood shouldn't mean depletion, and your dreams don't disappear when you become a mom. So whether you're rebuilding your health, rediscovering your identity, or growing something meaningful alongside your family, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. I got pregnant with my second baby when I was 11 months postpartum with my first baby. And then I got pregnant again with my third when I was 16 months postpartum after my second baby. So when people ask me if there is a right amount of time between babies, I have thoughts both from what the research tells us and from actually living this twice. Now, pregnancy spacing can be very, very personal for each person, and oftentimes maybe we plan for something and it doesn't happen, and oftentimes we plan for something and we get pregnant a lot sooner. And I think many moms can actually carry some guilt with both directions, where if you're having babies too close together, you hear about the risks, you feel like maybe it's a little bit reckless. However, if they're so far apart, I think often there's some guilt, like you're behind or you haven't started trying. When are you going to give your child a sibling? Or you feel like you've missed a window. And when I talk about this today, I don't want this to elicit any guilt or fear in you or in your timeline, whether it's a timeline that you have set for yourself or a timeline that you feel like you are living, and maybe it's not one that you would have chosen. I think if you Google how far between babies, like what should that space look like, there can actually be a lot of fear mongering online with really scary statistics, and there's no nuance. Yes, the research tells us a lot, and it can be really helpful when it comes to making some decisions, but it also doesn't really take into account real life, and real life doesn't always cooperate with the ideal timeline, which I am going to talk about kind of what the research says. But there's so many things like our age, our fertility history, and our family goals that I do think you need to factor in when you are trying to figure out pregnancy spacing. And I will also say where you live in your community can really shape that norm as well. I live in Utah, and there's a very large community of 2 under 2. That goes against what the research says you should be doing with this pregnancy spacing. However, here, people tend to have bigger families, they tend to have more children, and they tend to do it when they're younger. So that, in part, has shaped the community around where I'm from and where I live. So let's talk about what the research actually says. 18 to 24 months between pregnancies, meaning we end one pregnancy, you don't get pregnant again until that last one that baby is at least 18 months old. That is kind of considered the sweet spot, about 1.5 to 3 years in between those pregnancies. Now, there are multiple reasons why it is considered the sweet spot. There is more time for recovery, of course, physical recovery, emotional recovery, maybe even financial. And then also, there actually are some adaptations that your body goes through with pregnancy, where if you wait too long, it actually can put us at higher risk for certain things because our body's been, I don't know how to explain this, kind of like out of that pregnant window for a while. I'm going to get back to that. But that 18 to 24 months within 3 years is kind of considered the sweet spot for pregnancy spacing based on research. Now, getting pregnant with less than 6 months in between does tend to have the highest risk profile, with higher risk factors with pregnancy complications, preterm delivery, small gestational age. And this is simply because 6 months isn't a ton of time for your body to heal, for the uterus to heal. I mean, especially if you had a C-section delivery or other injury through a delivery, there's that to consider there as well. And this is not to scare anyone who does get pregnant under 6 months, because I do know multiple people that have Irish twins where their babies are within a year apart of each other and they're perfectly healthy and fine. What I'm just saying is that is what the research says is kind of the most risky, is getting pregnant within 6 months of being pregnant. And then we have kind of that flip side. So if you're over 5 years in between pregnancies, this actually can come with its own risk profile, and it's not automatically the safest just because your body had so much time in between to, quote unquote, recover. Like I said, there are some adaptations that your body goes through in pregnancy, and if you can kind of stay within those pregnancy adaptations, it actually can help with preeclampsia risk. And there is found to be a higher risk of preeclampsia in subsequent pregnancies if you're waiting over 5 years in between. Now again, this is just what the research says. This might not be what feels best for you and for your family. And I want to say that that time interval itself, that's not showing us the whole story, because when it comes to replenishing and nourishing your body, 2 moms at 16 months postpartum, they can be in very different places in regards to their replenishment and how depleted their body is from that last pregnancy. And if you know that you want to have, maybe closer, shorter intervals, being really intentional with your recovery is going to change what that shorter interval looks like for your body. Now, like I said in the beginning, after my first pregnancy, I was 11 months postpartum when I found out that I was pregnant again. That definitely is not in that 18 to 24 to 3 year time frame. And I will also say this is actually more so just personal advice from the midwife that I worked with after my first pregnancy, because I did end up with an unplanned C-section. She told me at least 6 months to wait. Now, of course, the research still tells us you need to wait a little bit longer, but just for that C-section incision, the wound in my uterus, she told me, you gotta wait at least 6 months before getting pregnant again. And honestly, she was kind of pushing, you have to be on birth control because of that, which I didn't love and agree with, but I think that is a story for another time. Now again, coming back, where I was 11 months postpartum, I have talked about how my second pregnancy was so much harder, and I definitely was not as intentional with my recovery after that first pregnancy. And I feel like it's honestly something that, unless maybe you're listening to this podcast right now, you don't know what you don't know. And as moms in general, we are not taught the importance of that recovery in between pregnancies, which is what I'm trying to do, but there are not many resources out there. So ultimately, many women feel a lot sicker going into subsequent pregnancies, and I actually have an upcoming podcast where I'm going to talk about that. But getting pregnant at 11 months postpartum versus with my next pregnancy, this current pregnancy, my third, where I was over 16 months postpartum, and I was much more intentional with my recovery, even though that 16 months is still technically a little bit sooner than what the research says. I feel in a much better place with this pregnancy and how prepared my body was going into it, because I was so much more intentional, not just for 3 months before I got pregnant, but for truly the entire 16 months of not having a baby inside me. I also want to touch a little bit on why, for many women, waiting longer isn't really realistic, or it might not even be the right decision. One indication is if you are advanced maternal age, if you are in your late 30s, or if you're trying to conceive in your 40s, and you want to have, more than one kid, waiting that 2 years in between pregnancy actually isn't necessarily the best idea. The research will still say that age is one of the worsening risk factors for prenatal health, which I personally feel like it's not necessarily the age, but how you are replenishing your body. However, there are increased risk factors with advanced maternal age, which is a case where maybe you want your kids closer together. In other areas, like I had mentioned, in my community, everybody does have kids closer together, so it seems, or you want your kids to have siblings close in age. Maybe that is what feels right for your family planning, and that's why you do get pregnant at 11 months postpartum, like I did, or at 16 months postpartum. And then, of course, I know many, many women who struggled really hard to get pregnant with their first baby. They were trying for months or a couple of years. And so when the time comes that they think they probably should start trying for another baby because it's going to take us a long time again, oftentimes they immediately get pregnant or conceive much faster than they previously had. And if you fall into this boat for any of this, I don't want you to feel guilty that you're not, waiting for the optimal timeline from what research says, where you need to have 2 years in between pregnancies. But I do want you to be really intentional with how you are nourishing your body. Yes, in the in-between season, but also in that pregnancy. Because even how you nourish in that pregnancy is going to make a difference too in how depleted and how that depletion compounds versus when you're not intentional with that nourishment. I do also want to touch on spacing after miscarriage, because I think that's a completely different question entirely. And I have heard two things from providers in my area, providers that I used to work with. Some will say, you don't need to wait at all. You can try to get pregnant again immediately. And some will say, give it a few months, get your period back. Let's confirm that you are cycling and ovulating, and just, wait for 3 to 4 months before you start trying to get pregnant again after a miscarriage. And in fact, I just had a client sign up with me in Nourish Moms Collective, and she had a miscarriage and was asking, what would be the optimal timeline. Her doctor didn't really give her a great concrete timeline for trying to conceive. And because in the collective, we kind of have looked at things with a deeper lens. We've looked at her gut, we've looked at her mineral testing, and we can actually see some things where waiting for 3 months could actually be beneficial for her. But I will say a big fat caveat. She's not just waiting. We have this concrete evidence and this information in our hands of what her body actually needs, so she can be prioritizing that and focusing on that. So when those 3 months come, her body is going to be in a much better place in order to conceive again, and in a much healthier place to support a growing baby. Just an example, we found on her gut test that she actually has a little bit of an immune system imbalance, and conception is very much an immune reaction that takes place. Your body does have to accept the embryo, and it has to continue accepting it as it's growing. And of course, this embryo is, half foreign. It's half created from the sperm of another person. And at times, yes, our bodies can attack that if we have an immune imbalance. And there can be issues whether we have low immune function or high immune function that we see in the gut. We also saw some mineral imbalances that were impacting her thyroid and her nervous system regulation and her body's ability to feel safe. And this nervous system regulation and just creating that overall safety in your body is really important in early pregnancy, because your body wants to invite a baby into a safe and comfy home where it knows it's going to be able to protect it. So in this case, where we do have more of these, concrete results in front of us, this is where it can be really beneficial to wait 2 to 4 months before trying to conceive again after a miscarriage, because we have a targeted gut and mineral support plan. You're not just waiting 2 to 4 months, but you're optimizing before truly trying again. And this is also the kind of testing that I did, and I think I talked about this as I talked about my whole third pregnancy episode a few episodes back. But this was the testing that I did 4 months before we wanted to start trying to conceive, just because I wanted to see what's not optimal and how can I make it optimal, so that when I am trying, I have my body in the best place that I could control, when this is a time where so much is out of your control when it comes to getting pregnant and staying pregnant. Ultimately, I think when it comes to pregnancy spacing, I think we kind of need to reframe the decision. Not necessarily what's the rule, what's the best time for me to get pregnant again with a Google search, but knowing the nuances of your body, your family, your timeline, your health, and your recovery readiness, because that is going to matter so much more than, 18 months on a calendar. I have clients who want to get pregnant after their youngest is 3 years old, and we optimize her body and they're able to get pregnant. And then I have clients who are 7 months postpartum, they're still exclusively breastfeeding, and they're wanting to try and catch their first ovulation so that they can get pregnant again. And that happens as well. I have a client, one in particular, who wanted her kids really close together. And so we spent 3 months focusing on her mineral foundation and her gut health while she was about 6 months postpartum. And she got pregnant on that first ovulation. Ultimately, like I said, we need to reframe what is actually going to be best for you personally and the ins and outs of your life, and not necessarily base it on the perfect number based on research. I have a few action steps for you if you're kind of in the midst of this right now, trying to figure out if your body's ready or if you should give it more time. Here's a few steps for you. First, I do think it helps that you know the general research window, which is what I've talked about in this episode, but you don't have to treat it as a moral rule, especially if your preference falls outside of that window. If you are trying again sooner, I want you to get really intentional right now with your protein intake, with your minerals, with your blood sugar stability, and make sure that you are nourishing and replenishing your body really intentionally at this time frame. And if you're not already, track your recovery signals. So your menstrual cycle, yes, tracking your cycle is going to be really helpful. Are you ovulating? Do you have a long luteal phase? Do you have a short luteal phase? But also additional recovery signals would include your energy and your mood. Because if you are down in the dumps all day long, and this was not your norm before pregnancy, there's still some recovery that needs to be done that's going to support your mood. Same with your energy. If you are crashing every single day, every afternoon, there is still some recovery that needs to be done, whether you are 6 months or 24 months postpartum. And if you do have a shorter timeline in mind, whether it's because of your age or your fertility history or just your family plans, I would say that is probably when testing matters the most. Don't guess at what your body needs. Truly, testing sooner rather than later is going to give you those concrete answers so that you can be sure that your body is in a good place to get pregnant again. And of course, as always, talk with your provider about your specific situation, especially if you had a previous C-section or if you've experienced a pregnancy loss. Talk with them and see what they recommend with spacing. And they likely probably won't say much about replenishment, so still make sure you are on top of that. If you know you want your babies close together or you're just not sure where your body actually stands right now, that is exactly what we dig into inside of Nourished Moms Collective in our one-on-one coaching. You can learn more at nourishedmomscollective.com. And in our next episode, we're going to talk about signs that your body actually is ready for another pregnancy.